Good morning and welcome. I'm Andrew Lansley, Strategic Counsel at Lowe Associates, and Strategic Counsel at Lowe Associates, and privileged and proud to be a member of the European Cluster Collaboration Platform team. Much looking forward to our discussion this morning. I have the honour to moderate our discussion this morning. Much looking forward to it. We are discussing global perspectives on cluster policies, looking at non-European Union countries. What are their policies, approaches, initiatives and lessons that we may take into the European Union cluster collaborations. I'm looking forward to our panelists. We have a very fine paneling coming up shortly. Before that, of course, we will, as always with Cluster Talks, have opportunities for you, our participants, to join in the discussion. We will have 3 Slido questions to put to you at a later point. And please also remember that we have the Q&A and chat functions for our discussion this morning. If you wish to put questions to our panelists, or indeed place on the chat some of the references that might be relevant to some of the discussions that are taking place. Let us begin, please, by going to our European Cluster Collaboration Platform team project manager, Nina Hopman, to tell us about news from ECCP.
Good morning, everybody, and happy to be here with you this morning to share some news from the ECCP and some upcoming opportunities for you. So we would like to invite you to join the Cluster Collaboration Lab, the so-called C2 Lab, which will take place in Strasbourg in France on the 25th and 26th of September. Together with the French Association of Polycompetitivité, the French clusters, we are going to organize this interactive workshop to support you in the creation of your next project. At the C2 Lab, you will have the opportunity to meet with partners, discuss your project ideas, and to initiate collaborations, for example, to apply for a European call together. And you can join either with a concrete project idea that you're already working on and have in mind, or offer your expertise and join others in the project creation. Register for this if you're interested in new collaborations in Europe and come to Strasbourg. If you're looking more into developing your skills as the cluster manager, then we have the Cluster Booster Academy for you, which is an format for up to 50 participants that will run over 5 days, 3 online training sessions, a coaching session in between, and then 2 in-person training sessions hosted in Poland at the beginning of March next year. And this Cluster Booster Academy will give you learning opportunities to further develop your skills as a cluster manager, to have peer learning experiences with the other participants, and to talk about the needs that you derive from your daily work and how to boost your capacities as a manager. So if you're interested in this, please register for the Cluster Booster Academy and apply. The next event format that we're inviting to are the so-called Clusters Meet Regions, which are events bringing together clusters and policymakers from different levels, so from local, regional, or national level, to strengthen the industrial ecosystems and to discuss how clusters can support the green and digital transition and to make our industry more resilient. So during the events, there will be shared good practices, and we will have also the chance to discuss collaboration between clusters and regional stakeholders for the industrial developments of regions. And we have 2 coming up in October, the one on the 10th and 11th, and the one in Spain in Palma de Mallorca on the 24th and 25th. And we're going to Germany and Belgium in November, in Heilbronn on the 13th and 14th of November, and in Charleroi on the 27th and 28th of November. So save the dates for those for which you're interested, and you can, when you click on the link in the chat, you can find more information on these events and then register. We will be happy to have you at those events. And if you're more looking into international opportunities, which is also the topic of today, I would like to present two concrete matchmaking opportunities, one with Singapore, where a European delegation will go to the Singapore International Energy Week and the 22nd until the 24th of October. And there's matchmaking on site for C2C, C2B, or B2B collaborations. The Singaporean partners focusing on clean energy, green tech, e-mobility, sustainability in digital tech, and the energy transition financing. That's interesting for you. You can apply for the matchmaking with Singapore. We're also going to India the month afterwards, so the 19th until the 21st of November, to the Bangalore Tech Summit. And here you will have the chance to meet with the Indian counterparts on, again, C2C, C2B, and B2B collaborations with a focus on biotech, digital green tech, and advanced manufacturing. So please register for this event if you're looking for partners in India. A lot of info, a lot of links in the chat, so have a look at that after the talk as well. And we are looking forward to seeing you at these events. Thanks, and back to you, Andrew.
Nina, thank you very much. There's some really excellent opportunities coming up in the weeks and months ahead. Thank you very much for that news. Let us turn now to the subject of our talk this morning and our discussions. As I'm sure many of you will know, there are some really valuable country fact sheets and indeed a summary report on approaches to cluster policies in non-EU countries. And to guide us through thinking about what the global scene looks like in cluster policies, we're delighted to have Jan-Philipp Kramer from Prognos, who is head of EU services at Prognos and a highly valued member of our ECCP team. Jan-Philipp, if you'd be kind enough to tell us about cluster policies in non-EU countries.
Thank you very much, Andrew, and good morning to everybody. Maybe not even good morning if there's an audience beyond the EU, so good afternoon or whatever time it is for you. Great pleasure to be here again in the cluster talk. I was here in the beginning of the year talking about European approaches. I think it's quite logical now for us to turn to the global stage and have a look into the approaches. And I think I can already spoil a little bit the upcoming intensity and regaining interest in clusters. We have, if you look at the background of our work, compiled a number of fact sheets, 56 in total. They cover, of course, the EU, but they also cover the so-called COSME countries and third countries. So it's a big variety. I will show you a map in just a minute. And the information, just to also put a small disclaimer here, comes from August to December 2023. And why am I saying that? There's quite some dynamic, as I mentioned before. And so in the meanwhile, maybe even some new approaches have been implemented. So take this as a small information. And I wanted to add, besides these fact sheets, we also prepare a number of input papers that shall help you whenever you start thinking about participating in matchmaking activities, such as Singapore, as was mentioned, Canada, Africa, and also we will work on something for India in the upcoming month. Now, what's in the fact sheets? And I just put here the example cover page of the country fact sheet for the United States. We do look a bit at the economic policy context to put into the discussions where cluster support fits in. We then look more detailed on the cluster programs, mostly on national level. But sometimes it's also worthwhile to give an example, at least for the regional level. And then we make a little assessment on the state of play around cluster policy in terms of its focus, its continuity, and evidence for impact. So just for you to know, the new fact sheets will be out quite soon. So the latest information will be ready. Now let's look at the map I talked about. I mentioned already we have these 29 COSME and third countries that we studied. So quite a broad array, if you imagine what is the background of this. And we identified, I think, a quite interesting spectrum of policy approaches for clusters. So all in all, around 50 relevant policies were identified in those countries. So 29 countries, 50 relevant policies. And out of that, 19 were national cluster policies. So it's, I think, quite interesting to see that out of the 29 countries, we found 19 national cluster policies and gave another 5 examples on regional ones, which is just, maybe the tip of the iceberg at the same time. It's also worthwhile to mention that often we see, policy evolvement over time, and therefore we included a category that we call more broad or sectoral policies. That could be something like SME policies, industrial policies that include elements of cluster thinking, right? And that could be preparing also the path into the more specific cluster approach. Now, I mentioned already dedicated cluster policies are those which really comprehensively support the development. And sometimes, and I think that's important to highlight, we may find even more than one. In big countries like the United States, for instance, we find more than one national policy that could address cluster support. So I will now not go into detail of the map so much. You can see in the coloring that we do see dedicated cluster policies across all continents, maybe slightly driven to more industrialized countries, but not solely. And that the more broad policies are found also basically everywhere across the world, with a slight focus on the Balkans, Latin America, and Asia. So what I will do now, I will go into 3 completely different continents with you. And I invite you first to join me in the US. So the United States, obviously, as you know, from the academic thinking, maybe was not the homeland of cluster thinking, because that emerged from Europe. But at the same time, the cluster concept was quite promoted, as you know, from American scholars. And at the same time, US policy in the past decades, at least, was rather indirect and not so strongly involved in economic development programs that we may know in Europe. At the same time, also the US, I think, understood that driving cluster development requires a framework, also from a national level, and that can be driven by different dynamics. Of course, competitiveness as one of the pillars, innovation, of course, as one of the pillars, but as I will show, it's also about equality and regional disparities in a way. So in the US, the Regional Innovation Cluster Program is one to mention. It's a rather small program, as you can see. In 23, it only had 10 million euros as program funding. It's been running for quite some time, since 2010, and it provides cluster funding of up to $300,000 US dollars. So a cluster organization can receive this support for events, for conferences, for operational costs. And typically it's a very short duration of support. It's a 1 base year support, and then there are 4 optional years. I think for people from the European cluster world, thinking about the time scale in which cluster support is possible, this may be an interesting information just to compare. And the number of clusters receiving support therefore varies from year to year. Now there, in May 2024, there are only 11 regional innovation clusters receiving support in the US. And in early 2024, there were, I think, 17. So the numbers change if you compare them over time. And interestingly, this comes from the Small Business Administration Office. And as I will tell you also in a second, there are various federal agencies and departments in the US who get involved into cluster policy. Now you could say, well, that's not so exciting, what Jan is selling us here on the Regional Innovation Cluster Program. But as I indicated, there's quite some dynamic. And we see that under the Biden administration, and you know also about the IRA and so on, there are a number of quite heavy funded and large initiatives. And I pick only one, there are more in our paper, which is quite significant, which is called the Regional Innovation and Technology Hubs Initiative. It's driven by the US Economic Development Agency, or Development Administration to be precise, with the Department of Commerce. And it's been running actually only since last year. In 2023, it was established as part of the CHIPS and Science Act in the US. And as you can already see on the slide and comparing maybe the numbers that you can read there, it's much more significant. The total program funding over 5 years is $10 billion US. And I think it's quite interesting to see how the US is approaching this. So, of course, they look at more advanced technologies. That's why it's called tech hubs. They have a stage approach. So they have 2 phases in this program with a competitive procedure. They start off in the first round, 31 tech hubs were selected. And they have to show their performance in order to move to stage 2 or phase 2. And so they can receive up to 500 million of implementation grants, but only 5 to 10 hubs will be selected of the 31. And then, as you can see, 40 to 70 million each is quite significant in the support that they receive. And the final point I wanted to highlight is the US also established something they call the Strategy Development Grant, which is $1-2 million US, not a very large one. But the idea behind this is to support the selected hubs partially, but also those who were not selected in the first round to work on their technology-based regional economic development strategy. So the administration understands that developing good strategies also requires resources. And I think this is quite important. As I said, there are more examples. The Green Hydrogen Hubs, for instance, is a similar initiative with $8 billion US of funding for the next couple of years. So also worthwhile to check out, driven by the Department of Energy. So another player in the cluster game there. Okay, let's move to Europe and to Norway. Completely different landscape, completely different geography, much smaller country, obviously, but a country that has been quite, I think, consistent in driving its cluster programs. And I haven't run a specific analysis now on the correlation between that, but we believe that policy consistency also pays off in economic terms. And I think Norway overall is performing quite well as its economy is robust. The early stages of the cluster work in Norway even date back to the 1990s. And they had a continuation of different programs that have been established. We think the first really outstanding and dedicated cluster program then was launched already in 2002 with the ARENA program, followed up by the Norwegian Centers of Expertise in 2006, and a continuation or extension of the ARENA program in 2019 with the ARENA Pro. And in the center of all of the developments now, the Norwegian innovation clusters are positioned. And what we find most relevant to highlight is that the development in Norway perceives a very stepwise approach. You can have an early phase support for regional clusters in order to establish the capacities for the first 3 years. Then you move to the Arena Pro stage. And at the end of the chain is basically the global centers of expertise. So something that in the Norwegian perspective are really the top clusters that are globally relevant in a way. At the same time, maybe it's also worthwhile to mention, in total, they have 34 clusters in a rather small country of 5.5 million people. So I think this needs to be considered. Final points here. I said there's some continuation. So also the things that have been supported changed. The Norwegian approach is rather soft. They do not do quite heavy investments in infrastructure or similar, but rather on they focus on capacity building and supporting scale-ups, acceleration, skills development, and similar things. And just now in 2024, they have started to further refine and continue their path in the cluster development with the 3 interlocking program tiers, as we call them, the Norwegian Innovation Clusters Connect, 3 years up to 265,000 euros. The Explore and the Impact, you can see the numbers. Funding increases. It's always limited to 3 years, so a maximum of 9 years below the known threshold also for support that we know in the EU. Now let's come to South Korea. Completely different again. You know that in Korea, from also the development history of the country, it was very much focused on developing heavy industry. So building industrial complexes is something that's quite known for the Korean, one could say even miracle of emerging into a global economy. And so also the cluster development has quite some angle on this. We have the Industrial Complex Cluster Program, which was the first dedicated program which has been established in 2005. It's the definition of a cluster is very much centered around this industrial complex, but integrating science and technology parks from a physical perspective as well. And it was a very top-down initiative, but a continuous one. So 2005 to 2009, early stage cluster development. 2009 to 12, growth stage. 2013 to 16, maturity stage. And then it stopped. And there was very little happening from our perspective. But as I said, new dynamics are coming. So in 2021, there was the so-called New Industrial Clustering Act to start again the cluster development, and following on that, the new National High-Tech Cluster Program was launched. And now we have 15 complexes that are supported. It's understood by the Korean government that South Korean government that they need to put a stronger place-based dimension on it, so local governments are more strongly involved. And they also have significant funding, as you can see, $1.65 billion over 5 years. That's roughly 330 million per year. So it's quite significant for 15 clusters, we believe. The instruments, as I said, high infrastructure focus, so developing shared facilities, corporate venture capital, and very interestingly, they have a quite large international research cooperation program, the Boston Korea project, receiving $60 million in funding to link the biotech industry of Korea to Boston. This is already under discussion to expand to other industries, semiconductors, batteries, quantum computing. So maybe something we should check out to connect our cluster systems in Europe with this program. I will speed up now, Andrew. I hope that's fine in our time management. A short comparative assessment, and then we go to the conclusions to open also the discussions. So you see that all of the three examples have differences, obviously, in the governance, also in the funding. But what they all do is they use different phases of development, which we find quite important. So it doesn't make a lot of sense to start off in a very complex, high-tech driven approach, but you need to level up the development. That's message number one. For Norway, it's interesting to point out that there are different sub-programs that exist at the same time. So they don't think that the speed of development can be identical in all cases. So they differentiate more, right? And I think this is also a smart way to acknowledge, but also when things are not working, KPIs are not met, funding will stop. Also very important. On the sectoral focus, the US and Korea programs are quite driven on high tech, as you can see in the examples. And only Norway chose a very sectoral neutral policy, which doesn't determine the areas top down. I think that's also interesting to see in their case. This is connected to my final point here. We see that these rather sector neutral programs are focusing more on these soft elements, funding cluster management, networking, but they don't have large project financing. Whereas these more sectoral driven fundings in the US, CHIPS Act, hydrogen, they have, and also in Korea, as I showed you, they have some larger funding tickets attached to this. And I think this is also worthwhile to mention. Now, summing up, there's a revival of these more sectoral driven cluster policies. We see that layered cluster programs with these multi-stage approaches, including competitive elements, so different stages you have to move up, are quite, I would say, interesting and relevant. And that these layered program structures are also important to acknowledge where you have high performance and where you don't have high performance. And last but not least, I already mentioned, it's funding sectoral policies is connected to significant funding, and I think it's actually needed in order to achieve the goals. Otherwise, if you don't have the funding, maybe it's smarter to focus on these more soft elements of developing strategic capacities. So, Andrew, I tried to speed up in the last few slides. I hope I managed to do that.
That's terrific. Thank you very much, Jan-Philipp. I thought that was all absolutely fascinating. Do stay with us, Jan-Philipp, and as we bring in other panelists, we will have questions for you. Do please put your questions up on the Q&A or the chat. I know what Jan-Philipp had to say was fascinating and will prompt many thoughts amongst our audience. We have a contribution now from Marco Linas, Director of the Division of Production, Productivity and Management, so the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean. We saw a little reference there in Jan-Philipp's presentation to some of the cluster development in Latin America and the Caribbean. Let's hear what Marco has to say.
Well, good morning, everybody. First, I would like to express my gratitude to the European Cluster Collaboration Platform team for this invitation. It is a real honor to be here and share with you a little bit about the work we're doing at the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, better known as CEPAL, regarding the development of cluster initiatives and other territorial productive articulation initiatives. Just to give you a little bit of context, at ECLAC, we are emphasizing the need of our countries and their territories to escalate and improve their productive development policies, which is the name we give to industrial policies, in order to address the challenge of a stagnant and even declining productivity we've had during the last decades. We understand productive development policies, or PDPs, mainly as collaborative processes between multiple actors belonging to the public sector, the private sector, academia, and civil society. Moreover, we think that much of the action in terms of PDPs needs to take place at the territorial level with the local actors, with a bottoms-up approach. Therefore, cluster initiatives arise as a concrete and effective way of organizing strategic agendas to address productivity bottlenecks that hinder the economic transformation of our territories. Now, Latin America and the Caribbean countries do not start from scratch on this regard. There are hundreds of cluster initiatives and the like across the region. However, we see that there's a lot of room for escalation and improvement. With this purpose in mind and having the European Cluster Collaboration Platform as a reference point, last year we launched a platform to promote and strengthen cluster initiatives and other territorial productive articulation initiatives in our region. At the moment, we already have almost 300 initiatives registered from 13 countries, representing more than 63,000 companies from different economic sectors. We are already implementing different activities and projects to strengthen cluster initiatives in our region. And part of this work has to be directed at how to connect cluster initiatives not only with other cluster initiatives in the region, but other clusters in the world. Therefore, we see great opportunities of connecting Latin American and Caribbean cluster initiatives with European ones. Joint efforts between the European Cluster Collaboration Platform and our platform could be a way of achieving this. So we really look forward to making this happen. And once again, thank you very much for this invitation.
Well, thank you, Marco, and it's really good to hear about the possibilities for mutual exchange between the European Cluster Collaboration Platform and that is being developed in Latin America and the Caribbean. So let us ask all of our audience. Let's ask our audience to contribute their views at this time. As you can see on your screens, hopefully, there is a QR code. If you take a picture of your QR code, it should allow you to enter Slido, and we will be asking you 2 questions to start off with. The first question just coming up will be a question relating to whether you have any existing cluster partnerships with non-EU countries. And as you can see, we've got 3 options. If you're able to get onto Slido and to respond to the question, can you tell us you have an extensive network, you have you're looking for new partners, or you have some partnerships, but you are looking for new partners? Now, we can see mostly at the moment, we have colleagues who are operating inside the European Union. We have colleagues who are looking for new partners. We have a few, but not a large proportion, who have an extensive network. I think that's the active poll. We've got a number of respondents. I'll leave it just a second there while we think about what those options are. We have those who are working only presently within the European Union, itself, of course, very large market. We have those who have some partnerships but are looking for new partners, and those who have an extensive network. And roughly speaking, we are looking at a relatively modest number who already have an extensive network. So options are out there, and a significant proportion of our correspondents, of our partners in the discussion this morning, are looking for new partners around the world. So let's move on to a second question. And the second question we're going to ask you is, what do you, in your view, of course, what are the benefits of entering into a collaboration with non-European Union partners? And here we're really looking for a bit of a word cloud to come up on what you feel those benefits might be. I won't lead the witnesses too much. We've heard, obviously, about the structure of policies that Jan-Philipp was telling us about in such an interesting fashion. What we're looking for now is what benefits derive from those policies if EU clusters are working with non-EU clusters. We heard from Marco there about how the European platform is something of a model that is being adopted with Latin America and the Caribbean. What is that giving us access to? We've got some good responses coming through. Of course, a different perspective, quite right. I think that is diversifying suppliers, and actually the question of the importance of value chains in a global marketplace is, of course, a key one. Market information is provided, access to markets. One of the essential aspects of any business is access to resources, access to markets. And we can see that creativity gets in there, that's important. Creativity, I remember businesses saying, however big we are, however important we think we are, most of the new ideas will come from somewhere else. We have to find them and use them. Partnering for public procurement, that is interesting because, of course, there are countries beyond the European Union who are qualifying for public procurement inside the European Union. That's really helpful. Thank you to all of our audience for participating in that Slido question. I think that's a really interesting and varied set of possibilities for how those benefits can be derived from a collaboration with our partners beyond Europe. So let us turn now to our panelists. We have three panelists, as you can see. I'm going to begin, if I may, by just asking each of our panelists to tell us something about the landscape for cluster activity and policies in their own country. Obviously, they would have seen how Jan-Philipp was describing some of the differences in terms of policy approaches. Some are bottom-up, some are top-down, if I can characterize them that way. Phased approach. Modest scale to very large scale. Let us turn first, if I may, to Asta Kristin Sigurjónsdóttir from the TCI network and herself Chief Executive Officer of Iceland Tourism Cluster. Asta Kristin, would you be kind enough to tell us a bit about the landscape for cluster policies and indeed cluster activity in Iceland?
Yes, and thank you for all of this great overview that you have presented until now. Really, really interesting listening. Yeah, for Iceland, we had a cluster policy, the first one ever made, and it was published and signed for the parliament in 2021. We all remember what was happening in 2021, but at least though the timing would have been better in a not the situation as it was then, it was super important to have a policy that it's a high level policy, but it was tackling the main issues of both the future challenges and also the opportunities that we were seeking. So the four major pillars, and it's similar, maybe most similar to Norway. We are more neighbors to them maybe than others in that sense, and also a non-EU country that makes us a little bit more in looking into what they are doing and what they have been doing through the last decades. But we focused really heavily on what the industries were having challenges with. So it was around, the policy was around digitalization, it was around health tech and healthcare and how we needed to develop and step up our game there. Sustainability and the growth sector of that, how to connect every industry into the circular economy, and then the globalization, how to connect to others and how to foster and speed up the connections from the industry into the big world. So that was our major pillars. What we are still lacking and what we are like constantly picking on the shoulders of our government is to have an action plan in hand also. It's great to have a policy that you are in the helicopter view looking over and supporting in a really good manner, but there are not a lot of funding involved. And it's more like if you are super, lucky in a way, you get through into the government level. But it's not, yeah, and the structure around the action plan and how to fund programs and projects, that is still not as good as we look at like in Norway and of course in the EU countries that are really the forerunners there. So in short, that is the situation in the policy in Iceland.
Thank you very much, Pastor Christine. We'll come back to you in a minute. I know there's a question in my mind, but I want to bring all of our panelists in. And let us turn, if I may, to Alberto Rodriguez, who is president at the IESDE School of Management. Alberto, do we have you with us?
Yeah, good morning to all.
Alberto, could you tell us a bit about, obviously we heard a moment ago from Marco about what is being done in CPAL and so on, and the complementarities of what's being done in Europe and in Latin America. But perhaps you could tell us something about Mexico itself, because actually I imagine the industrial policy in Mexico is quite an interesting one.
Yeah, it is indeed. I'm based of course, in Mexico and in the city of Puebla, which is the fourth largest city, and where the automotive cluster is very strong. We have both a Volkswagen and an Audi facilities producing and exporting a lot of cars to the US and even to Europe and to some other countries. So our journey has been very interesting. It has been a more bottom-up and I'll say academic-up kind of approach. And the story goes like this. When I was the dean of the School of Management, I am now the president. We were looking for international collaborations with other business schools. So we got in touch with the Institute for Australian Competitiveness based on Harvard, which Professor Porter used to lead until December, that he just retired from Harvard. But that has been a very interesting ride that started 18 years ago. So why I'm saying this, because the main idea of Professor Porter was to spread all the knowledge that they were developing in Harvard. So he established the microeconomies of competitiveness network with, we are still are like 100 institutions around the world. And in Mexico, of course, the School of Management and UPAEP. UPAEP is a private university. I was also have the opportunity to serve as vice president for several years. And the story is that we have been teaching a lot of these issues through the microeconomics competitiveness course. This course was designed mainly by Professor Porter and many scholars at Harvard and worldwide. By the way, I had the opportunity to watch a video where Marco Ginás was in that class during his years in Harvard. So we have produced many cases, many papers. So all our evangelization about cluster and cluster policy has been very important in Mexico and Latin America, since we have many students from countries like Colombia, Ecuador, and so on. No? So at a national level, we have produced a lot of research and data. We have been working in the cluster mapping project for Mexico. We created an organization named Sintonía, trying to imitate what the Basque country was doing with orchestra. So we have our main hub, Sintonía. Sintonía is privately funded, mainly by UPAEP University, but also by many industry leaders. And the information that we have been produced has been very important, because we have the maps of all the clusters of all states. We have both the traded and local cluster since 2003 until 2018. And we are producing more and more information, which, by the way, has been very useful to produce very good research. Viviana Zárate, who is following us today, is from Mexico, has produced very nice papers. Alfonso Mendoza. And we have to recognize that Pablo Nuño, who is the leader of Sintonía, has done a great job. And we have had the support also of two presidents of UPAEP and of the business community. So I will comment more on this about the local efforts and funding and all that. So,
yeah, please, Alberto. And I think people will be very interested in how the initiatives that you're describing were taken up, particularly perhaps by SMEs and startups and so on, how the value chain perhaps is extending from the initiatives that have been taken, so that more of the value chain is occurring in that cluster.
Yeah, so since we have had about 1,500 students, and many of these are from the business community, we have had the opportunity for them to support them to create 14 cluster initiatives that have been institutionalized. Of course, the automotive cluster is number one, because it's very, very strong. But one very interesting cluster is the educative cluster. Puebla is one of the main capitals of higher education in Mexico. And the higher education cluster has been very, very important to support the activities that we are doing and being or building the networks within other clusters and trying to collaborate. And one important part of this is that locally in the state of Puebla, the government decided to go for a cluster-based approach for economic strategy. And it's interesting because they are putting funding. And now by law, the local law, at the level of state law, the cluster-based policy is now in that law. So they are providing funding, they are providing support, they are providing coaching, they are paying UPAEP and all our initiative for all the research we're doing. So it has been very, very interesting, and very important things are happening in the value chain, for example, in the automotive cluster. We are trying to bring in a new company now into Puebla, and the cluster is working with the government to support that new foreign direct investment, for example.
Super. Thank you very much, Alberto. We'll come back to you with further questions, if I may, in a moment. But I just want to take the opportunity, last but not least, to bring our further additional panelist into our discussion. That is Tor Arne Belika from Norway. We've heard about Norway and the cluster policies in Norway from Jan Philippe as part of his presentation. I wonder, Tor Arne, if you're able to join us and tell us something about your work. Clearly, innovation performance is your particular advisory responsibility. I'm trying to hope that Tor Arne is there and able to hear me.
I'm here.
Super, thank you very much. If you had an opportunity to hear Jan Philippe, he set out the broader policy framework, but I wondered if you could tell us something additionally about, in particular, the role that innovation is playing in cluster development in Norway.
Yeah, I'll add to what Jan Philippe told you. I'm Tor Arne Belika speaking from Alta in northern Norway. My company, Innovation Performance, we organize a network of independent cluster capacity building and quality expert in the Nordics. So we visit the leading clusters in the Nordics quite often through the European cluster labeling scheme. So it's really interesting work that has been presented to us here. To add to Jan Philippe's analysis of the Norwegian cluster policies, I would add that there is a regional policy level. We have 14 regions, and all of these regions, they also have a cluster policy where they both hand out money to the cluster management organization, but also provide different types of support services for clusters, which is important. And in more detail, Jan Philippe, he mentioned 34 clusters, but that is the clusters that is part of the national program. In addition, there is like 70, 80 other clusters that is supported by the regions. And these are quite important. And the typical size of a Norwegian cluster organization is between 3 and 15 people, holding up to 200 members typically. 15 of them are gold labeled through the European labeling scheme. So we have, and we visit them every third year, many of them. We have get very close contact with them. And what's going on, I'll add to the discussions later, but it's very much about concentration and building capacity and building supercluster or meta clusters to be able to go international.
Yeah, super. Thank you very much. Can I, Tor Arne, thank you very much indeed for adding to that perspective on Norway. The point you were making about international cooperation, can I just pass that thought back and ask a question to Jan Philipp, if I may? I think many on the call will have been interested to observe the what you said about Boston and Korea, which of course is large scale and international. Of course, agglomeration in clusters and scale in clusters is an issue in itself. But in the past, there may well have been an assumption that clusters were by their nature geographic clusters. But of course, what we're increasingly finding is that clustering is more than simply the agglomeration of businesses or industries and synergies in one area. It can actually be international, and the cooperation can extend across. So I wonder if I can just put that back to you, Jan Philipp. In your studies across the globe, did you encounter many such collaborations over distance?
Well, thank you, everybody, for the discussion and also the question. I think, as Tor Arne just mentioned, the need for coordination that goes obviously beyond your region is quite important. And the example for South Korea, I would say, is in a way unique in the scale of support that they are putting. So they have a quite concentrated approach, but they also want to somehow be impactful, and that requires sufficient support. Beyond that, I think we already learned about the examples with the nice cluster map from Latin America, which is a similar idea as the ECCP. There are also in the past, of course, in the European schemes, initiatives for supporting internationalization. And broadly speaking, of course, and when you speak to cluster managers or policymakers who are not necessarily dealing with cluster policy, but with internationalization, they always say, if we want to connect, we bring our clusters to the trade fairs. We bring our clusters to these negotiations, as Roberto also said with regards to the story around FDI. So I think the idea that clusters are geographically confined is still correct, but you have to go beyond borders, and that's, I think, never questioned in a way. So yeah, I leave it here.
Yeah. Jan Philipp, yes, that is interesting. I mean, I can just add from my own experience, the only in the last year or so, there's been quite a significant development in the relationship between Cambridge and Manchester within the United Kingdom. There is a specific innovation cluster intended to be created between these two large university-led clusters based on research, of course, and that is often the basis for these relationships. And I imagine that is true in Boston and Korea, isn't it? It's essentially a research-led collaboration in the first instance.
Well, it's often based on that, but given, and I think that's maybe also the important difference that these policies need to ensure, is that we do have various global networks for research collaboration, and they are useful. But obviously here we're talking about the value chain that is connected. We are talking about access to finance, access to talents. So I think it needs to have an explicit, broader perspective. From the European programs, we often observe that Clusters are used as an interlinkage to enter new markets, to help SMEs to do that from their network, building knowledge about market regulations, access conditions, etc., but also looking for potential suppliers or buyers of their services or products. So I think academia can be a good foundation, academic linkages, but the design for the measure needs to explicitly go beyond that.
Sound there for a moment, but if I may, could I turn, if I may, to Alberto? There's a, I think, an interesting question from Marta in our chat, who is saying, well, much of the emphasis appears to be on advanced technologies, understandably, and on research-based industries, but also there's a great deal of importance in traditional sectors. Alberto, we've heard one of the policy drivers often of cluster policies in a number of countries is tackling regional inequalities. And of course, what that can often mean is that one has to develop industries and value chains associated with existing, possibly quite traditional manufacturing industries, maybe agricultural, and this will no doubt be true in Latin America, Caribbean, in quite a lot of cases, based on existing agricultural industries, traditional agricultural industries, and extending the opportunities linked to those. And to what extent, Alberto, if you're able to say, perhaps in the Mexican context, there must have been a great deal of traditional industry. How is the cluster policy seeking to develop the opportunities using, you had Michael Porter with you, comparative advantage is what he's all about, using the comparative advantages that Mexico might have in order to develop the traditional industries, as well as bringing in direct investment from abroad?
Yeah, of course. A general rule that we have for our cluster approach is this idea that we do not pick winners. We more observe the natural development of the local economy, and then we support like any initiative, no matter what, is a high-tech industry or more basic industry, because everything matters, no? Our main idea is that we have to create inclusive prosperity. That's why we also have added to these efforts the social progress index measures, trying the clusters to have a very important impact in, for example, employment generation, wages, and so on. No? So, of course, you have always like the rock stars kind of clusters. In our case, we have like the already established cluster as the automotive cluster, but then you observe some emerging clusters, no? Like, for example, software development cluster, that we have a very important cluster emerging in the northern part of Mexico, mainly in Tijuana and also Jalisco, no? So not picking winners is good. It's a very good approach, because that allows all the clusters to develop at their own pace. And the important part is you have to be supportive of both traded and local clusters and measure what matters.
Right. That's really interesting and helpful. Thank you very much. I completely get, I think I understand the distinction between picking winners and recognizing winners, which is quite a different thing. So thank you very much. We have in the chat, I think Lucia, I think it is, has raised a hand, and if our team were able to do so, I think, Nina, you might be able to, for Lucia to be able to ask a question directly.
Thank you. Here I am. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Welcome.
Well, just one question addressed to Tor Arne, but a huge thank you for all the participants for this lively knowledge sharing. Regarding Norway, the question is, we've seen, and this was really surprising to see 52 clusters active in Norway with quite a lot of resources. Alone, if we take the maximum 15 people working for 200 members, and the cluster policy in Norway has been running for quite some time in different shapes and forms. The question is, do you see any impact on the company size going global? So particularly for the clusters that are supporting the globalization, with this kind of strong support that they are having, do you see them literally taking off on a global stage? Are they rather oriented towards Europe or towards United States or Latin America, Asia, Africa, wherever? So that would be interesting to see what is maybe the return on investment of such a strong support in the terms of the purpose they are supposed to follow.
Thank you very much. That's a very interesting question. To Arne, the question is directed to you and about Norway and ambitions, and indeed the scale up and global ambitions of the clusters from Norway. Do you have a view on that?
Yes, the Norwegian clusters in the top programs like Global Centers of Expertise, many of them, actually there are only 3 at that top level. They have had a lot of really good internationalization results. But in the level below, the typical situation is that industries that is export oriented is represented by many regional clusters trying to build collaboration to organize better to go international. But many of them has not been succeeded, not succeeded yet. So we are quite disappointed with some of the Norwegian clusters' participation in the international scene. And that's why this focus on building meta clusters or super clusters inspired by, for instance, Denmark is really focused, and how to do it by stick or by carrots.
Thank you.
Arne, sorry to interrupt, but Arne, could you just say, when you refer to supercluster inspired by Denmark, can you tell our audience a little bit more about what the characteristics of that looks like?
Yeah, Denmark had the same situation regarding the number of clusters and the regionalization of clusters 4 or 5 years ago, as Norway has today, approximately 100 clusters. And they introduced a strategic policy where they picked 14 sectors where Denmark had potential to export, and they invited into a competition where only 1 cluster were allowed to be funded in each of these industrial focus sectors. And then they built superclusters that had regional presence by offices in the region that had activities in these sectors. And then they had a national management that was resourced so that the average Danish cluster is now 3 times as big in terms of employees in the cluster management organization as Norway has.
Oh, that's very interesting. Thank you very much for giving us further detail about that. If I may, I have one more Slido question, if people can return to their Slido for a moment. That question relates to sectors. Obviously we're focusing in part now on the collaborations that clusters within the European Union might be able to enter beyond the European Union. And this question is really about sectors. Which sectors might offer the most benefits for those collaborations? And we're hoping that our participants might offer some thoughts on which of those sectors offer that partnership potential. Do we have any responses coming in from our participants? While we're doing that, can we talk while people are responding to that? Jan-Philippe, if you'd be kind enough, you were describing in your analysis some of the sectoral responses. Some of the clusters have sector focus, some do not. I wondered if you could talk us through a bit how those sector focus, the sector foci are developing over time, because clearly in the past, sectors often used to be quite narrowly defined. And now what we're finding, of course, is that there are increasing synergies between technologies in different sectors that make clusters increasingly multi-sectoral, is my suspicion. I know from my own knowledge in Cambridge, the relationship, for example, between the development of the research in electronics, IT, and now AI with life sciences has been an absolutely fascinating process over recent years. So I wonder, Jan-Philippe, if while we're seeing what people put up on the Slido, if you could tell us something about how the sector focus of clusters is shifting over time.
Yes, I'll give it a try. The question that was in the chat in a way also pointed to that, and Alberto has already answered parts of how it is approached in the Mexican case. And I think it's, when you look at, for instance, the US, it has different layers. On the one hand, if you look more at the regional cluster support, that is also available. So we studied one program from Washington State, which is called the Evergreen Manufacturing Growth Grant, which is looking at clusters. It comprises what Alberto also emphasized, the display of the competitive agglomerations in the state. Of course, there are also then new features coming up, such as clean tech, which maybe a few years, maybe 10, 15 years, you wouldn't have discussed in that regard, or renewable energy, for instance. If you look more at these strategic large-scale programs, they all have one, I think, specific feature, which is around sovereignty, also around security, in order to ensure in the global competition very clearly that the industry is located in the US. And this drives the policy decision to have hydrogen, to have semiconductor hubs and similar events. So quite comparable to the discussions that we're having in the EU. Evolution over time, I think you're right that obviously cross-innovation is becoming more important. And if you would simply pick a sector according to the NACE classification, so the statistical classification system that we're using to measure, you would fall very short of the right boundaries of your cluster activity. So even speaking about automotive in the case of Mexico, you need software development to be connected to it. You can't speak about building simple engines anymore.
We have a few moments ahead of us before I have to, unfortunately, time is against us. There's always more to discuss than there is time available. But I wonder, Jan-Philippe, before I come back to the other panelists, we have a question which I think Angela has been asking from Spain. She thinks she would like to know what the panelists think the current challenges for collaboration between EU and third countries are. Obviously, we're looking here at the positives, opportunities, but are there in fact barriers or challenges? Perhaps barriers is too harsh a word, but challenges that have to be overcome.
Well, we haven't studied that in detail, so I need to base my answer a bit on my observations, but we have cluster managers here. They know better than me as an analyst, if you want. But obviously, what we see already from the chat is transparency is an issue in terms of identifying the strong partners that you want to collaborate with. So simple measures to support the matchmaking, as the ECCP with support of the Commission is doing, is quite useful, I think. So that's increasing. And then the question is, how much resources are available to actually drive meaningful collaborations thereafter and develop projects that benefit both sides? So I think this is something where we may have a slight gap in our portfolio, but it's also something, of course, which cluster members, if they see the benefit, can stimulate. So it's not always just calling for the government to chip in some grants.
And would it be fair to say that often clusters are a way in which governments can pursue a supportive approach of industrial policy without entering into dangerous territories in terms of state aids, because these are effectively support levels available for whichever companies and businesses are best able to utilize them. So to that extent, not really susceptible to challenge on state aid grounds.
I'm not sure if we have time to go into that. There are some limitations.
Specialist in that territory.
Yes, but of course, it's a leverage. I would say it's a leverage way to develop.
To our other panelists, just a final word, if I may, just to come to Asta Christine, as it were. Any additional opportunities that you think can be exploited in terms of collaboration between European Union activity, cluster activity, and yourselves in Iceland?
Yeah, and I maybe want to jump a little bit into the global perspective through the TCI lens, because we are operating in 5 different or 6 different chapters through the globe. And I think that the barriers that we are talking about, they are much more in our minds than actually, because when you sit down with people from Latin America, from Asia, from Oceania, or from North America or Europe, we start with, okay, we think we are super different and that the challenges are way, between, and the gap is so big. But when it comes into the conversation, we are so much more alike, and the challenges are, if we can simplify it down to the sisters of digitalizations and sustainability, and then we need talent, we need people to educate themselves in the sectors that the countries are of course different in. But then we also need to simplify things, and we need to integrate the cluster methodology into other policies also, not to have it so separate. So I think we are much more alike, and we can do so much more together if we build up trust and we get to know each other more. So yeah, thank you for a great talk here today.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed, Asta Christine. Forgive me, Tor Arne, I don't have time to come back to you, but Alberto, you had your hand up. Was there a final point you wanted to add on that?
Yeah, I think the opportunities are incredible. In some ways, Europe is leading in many industries, in many clusters. So you have a lot of things to add to our local economies, no? And the best case that we have studied is the Dutch flower cluster case, because it emerged as a very important local cluster in Europe, but then they expanded and they are becoming more than just producing flowers. I think the auction floor is and all the technology is very important. So the local companies in Europe are now investing in countries like Ecuador or Colombia, for example, or even in Africa. And why is that? Because they found very important competitive advantages on those countries that are very complementary of the already well-set strategy of the Dutch flower closer to still being the leader, no? One good example is in Ecuador. In Ecuador, you can raise exotic tropical flowers that you cannot raise even in the best greenhouses in Holland, no? So I think that is a very interesting path to analyze and to find out which clusters that you already have and are strong in Europe can find competitive advantages in some other countries. We can establish that kind of collaboration in order to our local cluster to be upgraded by your insights, your technology, and even FDI and so on.
Thank you very much. Tor Arne, I must say a big thank you. Any final word that you wish to offer?
Yeah, I think we find across Nordics that the European Cluster Collaboration Platform is still underused. So we need more clusters to start using, knowing the services and using the services. So a promotion campaign for national states and regions would be good.
Super. Thank you very much. That's absolutely excellent point on which to close our panel discussion. May I offer very warm thanks to all of our panelists for their excellent contributions and to the audience for their contributions through Slido and other questions. Let us turn as our final, before we close our talk this morning, as our final moment with Nina to look at forthcoming funding opportunities. Nina, please.
Many thanks, Andrew, and many thanks to the panelists. Very interesting indeed to follow what you're doing and your insights into your respective countries and following very intensively. Just to close, we would like to share some upcoming opportunities that might be relevant for you, for the audience, in terms of open calls available on the EU Funding and Tenders portal. There's a call open, overcoming barriers and delivering innovative solutions to enable the green transition. Here, proposals funded under the topic should identify barriers to uptake by end users of new knowledge and innovation for the green transition on aspects of water resilience, circular economy, biodiversity, zero solution climate change, address different social, economic and cultural factors that derive in this, and also develop solutions to overcome these barriers that were identified. And this is a topic under the Horizon Action Grant. You see the topic ID here in the link, in the chat, please. And we will put the link in the chat so that you can click on it. The deadline is the 24th of September if you want to apply for this call. The I3 instrument has all three strands open. The instrument, which by full name is the Interregional Innovation Investments Instrument, wants to create linkages for interregional collaboration, bringing together actors from different EU regions for joint innovation projects. And the strand B aims to have concrete experimentation of new approaches, solutions, and good practices to engage in interregional innovation processes, and to have a pipeline of potential investments as well as business plans for those implementations. So the topic is under the I3 Action Grant. The deadline is the 14th of November. Please click on the link in the chat to learn more about the call. And the other two strands are also open, which is strand 1 and 2A, with a deadline of the 5th of December. And here, the strand 1 wants to offer financial and advisory support for investments in interregional innovation projects in shared and complementary to smart specialization areas. And the strand 2 focuses more on the development of value chains in less developed regions to enhance the integration into the EU value chains. As I said, 5th of December, a little bit more time. Click on the link in the chat to see the details. We talked about national and regional innovation programs. There's a call open also for mutual learning and support schemes for those programs in Europe. So proposals should contribute to reduce fragmentation of innovation ecosystems and the national or regional startup support schemes, and enhance the cross-border network connectivity and interregional collaboration, as well as expand cooperation, focus on inclusive and gender equal innovation ecosystems, and reduce territorial inequalities. The deadline for this call, which is under Horizon, it's a coordination support action, is the 19th of September. You'll find the topic ID here in the screen and the link in the chat. And last but not least, as a reminder for concrete opportunities for SMEs, which are provided by the Euroclusters, which are joint initiatives of cluster organizations in Europe in different industrial ecosystems. And they have various calls also open for internationalization. For example, the Euroboost Tax Eurocluster, which focuses on textiles, is offering internationalization activities with Australia. We have Friends CCI, which is on creative and cultural SMEs. There's a call for providers for solutions on internationalization as well. And going to the next slide, for example, also the Ingenious Eurocluster, which is focused on energy-intensive industries, offers internationalization grants for SMEs related to Africa, Asia, North America, Latin America. So, but not only, so there are also training opportunities, opportunities for SMEs for innovation projects, So have a look at the different calls that are offered by the Euroclusters with different deadlines, different focus, all published on the European Cluster Collaboration Platform. So you can find the details and see whether members of your clusters could benefit from these calls and funding opportunities. So thanks for that, and
thank you. Thank you, Nina. Thank you very much for all of those interesting funding opportunities. And thank you once again to all of our colleagues. May I remind all of our participants, and please pass it on to your colleagues, opportunities to register for forthcoming talks on the 3rd of July, funding for strategic technologies for Europe. I know that will be of widespread interest, and a particular very interesting sector focus on the 10th of July, transition pathway for chemicals. And do please recall that the discussion can continue through the European Cluster Collaboration Platform, the general discussion group there. As we've heard in the chat, the recording of this talk will be available and an opportunity to continue the discussion there. Thank you for all of that excellent participation today. Visit the website, follow on social media, and please post on social media, and we look very much forward to you joining us again for cluster talks, not least the next one, funding for strategic technologies on the 3rd of July. But for today, thank you very much for your participation. Thanks to our speakers, all excellent. And thank you to the team for organising it, and all of you for being with us. Have a very good day.